the tables, pull the slots, catch a show. Las Vegas, Nevada is one big thrill ride.
Vegas is one of a kind.
It's fabulous here, especially the evenings. They're the best part.
Nearly 40 million fun seekers flock to this glamorous world of pleasure every year.
You have all the gambling and the amenities. It's really nice.
I really love this city.
But beneath the desert soil lie hazards that could turn this fantasy land into a disaster zone.
Las Vegas Valley has 6 to 8 main faults.
And any one of these faults could rupture at any moment. In fact, over the last 150 years, 24 earthquakes of magnitude 6 and larger have hit Nevada.
We're the third most seismically active state, behind, of course, California and Alaska.
Because much of the state is sparsely populated, these quakes did relatively little damage and fortunately caused no loss of life. But if an earthquake were to hit densely populated Las Vegas, it would cause a disaster of unimaginable proportions. And every year, the scope of potential destruction increases as Las Vegas grows.
It's the fastest growing area in the United States. It has been for the last 10 years. We get about 5,000 people a month that move to what we call the Las Vegas Valley.
That's an ever-growing number of people at risk should one of these deep and powerful faults erupt. To see what horror could befall this booming desert city, we have only to cross the state line to Sylmar, California. The city of Sylmar lies in a sun-filled valley just 28 miles north of LA at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains. Until February 9th, 1971, Sylmar was a tranquil enclave, but all that would suddenly change on this fateful day. That morning, Jim Hazard, a 22-year-old nursing attendant, is on duty in the psych ward of the Olive View Hospital.
The inpatient services for about 50 patients and 10 staff was on the second floor of this 2-story building.
At 6:01 a.m., Hazard gets the shock of his life when he's hit by a terrific jolt.
I instinctively grabbed a TV that was on a stand, and then we were going down.
Hazard feels the floor give way under him.
The earth kept shaking. The lights, of course, immediately went off. The noise was deafening, with the building collapsing around. There was a lot of dust in the air.
As the floor continues to heave, Hazard realizes what's going on.
I think we're dealing with an earthquake.
For 60 terrifying seconds, the earth continues to quake, then finally it stops. Fortunately, everyone on the second floor survives the quake, but their ordeal is far from over.
And you start thinking, okay, it looks like I'm gonna live, but is this roof gonna collapse?
In fact, the entire building is tilting, and that's not all.
We saw we were real close to the ground instead of being 1 story above the ground.
Jim realizes the first floor underneath them has totally collapsed.
The first floor was compressed into a foot. If we were downstairs when the earthquake hit, we all would have died.
Jim fears the rest of the building may topple at any moment as aftershocks thunder around them. In a panic, Jim and his colleagues search for the nearest possible escape route.
The first thought was to just go out the windows.
But the windows are 1-inch thick plexiglass, sealed shut. A typical safety precaution in psych wards.
They had these IBM typewriters that were massive. And I grabbed one of them and I threw it at the window thinking it would break, and it just bounced right off. So the one thing that was certain was that we weren't going to go out any of those windows.
Knowing they may have only minutes before the roof falls in, they grope through dark corridors in search of an exit. But every door they come upon is warped shut by the building's partial collapse.
These doors, though, were hopelessly jammed, so we couldn't get through.
Finally, they're able to pry open a door and stumble to safety.
And just this, a relief, the personal relief.
Jim and his colleagues are fortunate to survive, but not everyone in the hospital is so lucky. 3 patients and a worker are crushed inside the crumbling building. 49 others are killed inside a nearby veterans hospital, and a collapsed highway crushes 2 people in a pickup truck.
There were 65 people killed in the Sylmar earthquake.
The Sylmar earthquake, which registers a 6.6 magnitude, sends shockwaves of a different sort through the scientific community.
It was a period of confusion. We didn't understand what had happened.
Scientists are taken by surprise because the quake erupted on a fault they thought was inactive.
That had been identified as a fault, but was not thought to be a very dangerous fault. From the Sylmar earthquake, we learned that earthquakes can happen in unexpected places.
Scientists also learn a great deal more from the Sylmar quake.
The 1971 earthquake for many years was the most important earthquake because it gave a number of important records of what the ground shaking was like in close to the earthquake. When people first looked at the records, there was a great controversy because the shaking was so violent that many people didn't believe the records.
The intense shaking demolished structures expected to withstand quakes, like the Olive View Hospital, built to the latest engineering standards.
The Olive View Hospital, it was extremely violent ground motion, and it probably moved about that fast. It snapped all the columns on the first floor, and the first floor just came down. Since that time, there have been some very important changes to the building code.
California, within about 1 year, passed new laws to regulate the seismic safety of hospitals.
They found that it was critical to make the reinforcing steel connect between the beams and the columns, and so those were important changes to the code. And in addition, they discovered it was very important to put steel in a spiral wrap around the columns and beams.
The Sylmar earthquake also shook up ideas about how to build freeway overpass ramps.
Those ramps came down in the 1971 earthquake. They were rebuilt and came down again in the 1994 earthquake. So that's turned out to be a bit of a test bed for how one builds a freeway.
And yet Sylmar was fortunate in one way.
We have been lucky in California for the last couple of earthquakes that they have occurred at times when the freeways were not so crowded, when the schools were not occupied, when people were in their homes.
A quake like Sylmar could hit Las Vegas one day. What makes the possibility even stronger is that there's not just one major fault there, but 8, including the 20-mile-long Frenchman Mountain Fault.
Frenchman Mountain Fault would probably have the biggest earthquake. It also has the longest surface rupture length, so that would be considered potentially the most hazardous.
If a fault like this ruptures, it would pack as much destructive power as 6 million tons of TNT, unleashed upon Las Vegas's residents and its hordes of unsuspecting tourists. It's a horrifying scenario. Up next, can Las Vegas beat the odds?
It's very difficult for us to say whether there would be an earthquake in Las Vegas this week, next year, the next 1,000 years.
When It Could Happen Tomorrow returns. Las Vegas has long been the city of dreams and desires. Now it seems more and more people want to live the fantasy.
Population continues to grow. I hear figures of between 7 to 10 people per hour as the net growth coming into the valley.
And a growing population means a construction boom.
Right now, we're putting up more new buildings than New York and LA put together.
But the land under these buildings is thick with earthquake faults, created thousands of years ago. There are at least 8 major faults, including the 20-mile-long Frenchman Mountain Fault that lies along the base of this mountain. Over the millennia, these faults have cracked, causing one side to drop down. The repeated cracks and drops have created a basin, the Las Vegas Valley.
The Frenchman Mountain Fault's been the major basin-forming fault, and that just keeps dropping down.
At any time, one of these faults could rupture, causing an enormous earthquake. But it's not just faults that put people at risk. The loose soil that fills the valley basin is also treacherous. Formed through millions of years of erosion, this loose soil is now 3.5 miles deep in places and is soft and unstable.
buildings that are built on soft soils will typically be shaken more than buildings that are built on hard rock.
Even worse, water can accumulate in the top 30 feet of some of the soil. That can cause the soil to become even more unstable through liquefaction.
Well, liquefaction is this process where you have moisture in the soil, and when you have shaking occurring, it turns into quicksand, essentially.
Liquefaction causes the soil to stop being able to bear any load whatsoever. So the building will actually sink, tip over and sink in the material.
Normally, there wouldn't be much water in desert soil, but Vegas's growing population is changing the landscape, creating a man-made risk.
We've actually created a liquefaction hazard by watering. As the population has increased, more golf courses are around, people water their lawns, you have a lot of surface water now.
Soft soil and liquefaction combined can increase the amount of shaking in a quake by a factor of 10, giving a magnitude 7 quake the impact of a monster 8 trembler. When this time bomb goes off in Las Vegas, it will be devastating. It's June, and Las Vegas is packed with tourists and convention visitors. The action is hot in the casinos, but it's even hotter outdoors, where the temperature is above 110 degrees. This sizzling heat could fell many with heat stroke, but tourists don't seem to mind.
It's nice and air-conditioned, so I don't really worry about it that much.
But this air-conditioned paradise could shatter with one crack in the earth. At 4:12 p.m., 20 miles of the Frenchman Mountain Fault suddenly ruptures. One side drops down 6 feet. The rupture releases energy 900 times as powerful as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima.
You'll have the ground kind of dropping out from underneath you, and that could present a lot of damage on the structures.
The earth begins to shake as the released energy spreads like ripples in a pond.
It's a large earthquake, and that energy just comes bounding into the valley and just bounces around and just rocks us like there's no tomorrow.
The result of this magnitude 7 quake is terrifying. All along the strip, hotels weave and sway.
This is a very dangerous thing for a tall building to move it around like this, because tall buildings are very flexible. Every time I moved it, it would sway a little further. They've got tremendous inertia in them.
Inside, tourists clutch at the furniture as suitcases crash to the floor. Decorative objects turn into flying weapons.
What typically happens to people is they have stuff falling on them. You know, that's what kills people.
Fortunately, the 3-legged design of the newest towers provides bracing for them to stay intact. But elsewhere in the valley, brick and concrete structures collapse as the soft soil amplifies the intensity of the quake.
Brick is always a bad thing in an earthquake. That stuff falls on you, you know, it falls on the ground.
In some areas, liquefaction occurs. The water-filled sediment turns to quicksand.
You can end up with parts of buildings sinking.
Debris crashes down on people in the street as they run for their lives. Meanwhile, elevated highways twist, flipping cars caught in the rush hour traffic into the air. Overpasses shatter.
Some of the overpasses we have are rather old, and they're not built to withstand a large earthquake.
A minute later, the ground finally stops shaking. By this time, the city is ravaged. Hundreds of people are pinned in crushed vehicles and buried under concrete and steel. Then, fires break out, started by gas leaks from lines ruptured underground.
There could be fires or buildup of gas in confined spaces. It could be potential explosive areas.
The blazes spread quickly, engulfing homes that had survived the quake. There's no water to put them out because water pipes are broken. Although some of the hotels have backup generators, the rest of the city loses its power. And that means no air conditioning.
during the 110, 115 degree temperatures. There's the possibility of no air conditioning, food would rot. It can be a great difficulty for people just to stand those temperatures.
In 1 minute of unimaginable horror, and in the hours of chaos and confusion that follow, the city of pleasure becomes the land of grief. What hope does Las Vegas have of escaping this tragedy? There's no preventing a quake, but safer construction may save lives.
There are new techniques as far as the anchoring systems of buildings on the foundation so they won't fall off the foundation.
When It Could Happen Tomorrow returns. If an earthquake strikes Las Vegas, glamorous buildings will be death traps unless they are well constructed. Officials are working closely with earthquake scientists and engineers to help the city withstand such a disaster. Their best weapon? The latest building codes based on what they've learned from other earthquakes in California.
Mostly codes are built based on hindsight. For most types of buildings, if something worked in past earthquakes, there's really no reason to change it. If it didn't work, they changed the code.
The soaring new hotels on the Strip have been designed according to these codes.
The new ones, the Wynn, the Bellagio, the Aladdin, so many of them, the MGM, use state-of-the-art construction techniques.
And older buildings are being retrofitted with devices to reinforce them and make them safer.
You can put piles and beams underneath buildings that exist.
Builders excavate around and below the structure, then install steel piles underneath. Also, the state is working on improving the safety of old elevated roadways and completely replacing others.
One of the good things in being the fastest growing area, we've been taking a lot of bridges down and replacing them with newer bridges because we've been expanding from 2 lanes to 10 lanes.
Las Vegas's eternal quest for newer, bigger, better has led to the raising of many of the older, less sturdy hotels.
Up and down the Strip, they just completely are replacing all of those hotels, and most of them that were here 15 years ago have been removed.
But while officials work to make public buildings and roads safer, residents also need to take action. Discover how you can protect yourself and your property.
There are many things that individuals, families, businesses can do to prepare for earthquakes, and you, of course, have to prepare in advance.
Next on It Could Happen Tomorrow. No one knows when an earthquake could occur. But if you're a Las Vegas resident, there are some simple improvements that can make your home more earthquake resistant.
Think of the weak link of where the house connects to the foundation. And when it shakes, what it means is that the house can walk off the foundation. Simple bolting of the house and a few reinforcements can take care of that problem. So it typically costs in $3,000 to $10,000 range.
Another easy fix can save money and lives.
Making sure that your water heater does not fall over in an earthquake is an obvious thing to do, because if it does go over, there's a good chance you'll fracture the gas line going into it, and you may have a fire at that point. Having some automatic shut-off valves on the gas is a good thing to do.
Even better, the water will be there when you most need it.
A hot water heater becomes a 40, 50, 100-gallon supply of water for you, too, in the event of emergency.
Many deaths and injuries in earthquakes are caused by falling objects. Take a look around and see how secure your living space is.
The kitchen is an incredibly dangerous place. Not only can things pull off the walls and have exposed electrical and gas, a refrigerator can just tip over and crush somebody. But people love to put that crock pot on the top shelf. It comes right down to your head. It's going to hurt.
There are easy remedies for these hazards, too.
Simply tacking the cabinets to the wall, putting little closures on the cabinet door so they can't bounce open and your dishes come out. These are very simple things.
And when an earthquake does strike,
The basic advice is to drop, cover, and hold on. So if there's a Nice big table in the room you're in. Get under the table and hold on to the leg.
There's no telling when the big one will hit, so it makes sense to do these things now. Because a devastating earthquake could happen in Las Vegas, and it could happen tomorrow.